Hello, welcome to Miss Rita's story time. Some days are good days for sewing, some days are good days for baking, and some days it's just good to curl up with a book and read. And we're going to start this one. This is The Quilt by T Davis Bunn. And I'm going to read this setting for about 30 minutes and then we'll stop and read the rest of it another time. And it says, a truly beautiful story that transcends time and place. Beautiful cover on it. If I can get, and there's not many pictures to show you, so I'm just going to read. All right. This book is dedicated to the memory of my grandmothers, Alice Coates Smith, Maud Davis Bunn, and to my mother, Becky Bunn, with love and thanksgiving. Light is sown for the righteous, and gladness for the upright in heart. Rejoice in the Lord, ye righteous, and give thanks at the remembrance of his holiness. Psalms 97, 11, and 12. We're going to start. Once upon a time, not so very long ago, there was a little girl who grew up and had a family and tried to raise it as she thought the Lord would want. After a while in the ways of this earth, she found herself growing old. The seasons seemed to whirl by with ever-increasing speed. The older she became, the harder it was to stop and savor each little moment, because all the moments that had come before were now ganging up on her, pushing her with ever greater pressure toward that final door. Life's current became so swift that the days and weeks and months which used to mark her passage no longer held any meaning. They all flowed together into a kindly pastel blur, with little flecks of light every now and then to illuminate the world before her failing eyes. Grandchildren were born, other little girls to help take the first fragile steps upon life's way. Lifetime friends passed on to that higher ground, their absence like vacuums in her world. And the faster the current seemed to flow, the more still she seemed to become. All her remaining energy became focused on that which lay ahead. There came a time when her hands grew swollen and twisted by arthritis. She would look down at them and have difficulty seeing them as they were. Somewhere deep inside, she knew, was captured the fragile beauty of a 17-year-old farm girl who had given her life in holy matrimony to a man now 11 years in the grave. Sometimes she would look away from the window by which she sat, or look down from the television that kept her company between visits of her beloved family, and she would knead and squeeze her hands one with the other. There were so many skills within those hands, so many memories, so many stories to tell, and something would touch her heart then, a gentle yearning, the whisper of a melody she would strain and still not be able to hear. It was like walking in the middle of the night, lying there in her lonely darkness, like waking in the middle of the night, lying there in her lonely darkness, staring at the ceiling overhead and listening to the laughter of children who had now grown up to have children of their own. Yet she could still hear her young children and feel them so close that it was almost as though they were there in the room with her. Exactly what it was they said she could not make out, but somehow she felt it was important, as though these gentle ghosts of a time long ago, long gone, were there to remind her of something. And during her days, as she sat and pressed and kneaded her fingers, she would hear a gentle voice calling to her. There was something left undone. When the neighbors talked of her, which was often, they all used one word to describe her. The word was beautiful. They would even say it to her face, some of them. Meri, you are the most beautiful woman I've ever laid eyes on, and they'd mean it. Her reply was always the same, honey, your eyes are worse than mine. Then she'd peel off her trifocals, blink in that fragile way of very old ladies, and pass her glasses over, saying, here, see if they help you any. and the people would always laugh and change the subject, wishing there was some better way to tell her what the feeling was that they had right then in their hearts. Even Everett, her son the businessman, would come in and sit longer and quieter than he'd ever sat in his life. Wednesday morning was Everett's time, on account of his having to be at the farm machinery auction on that side of town. He'd come in and pour himself a cup of coffee and lean over and kiss his mother, very self-consciously, on the forehead. Everett had always been self-conscious about any show of emotion. His wife had once confided to Meri that Everett was the only man she'd ever met who could get red in the face hearing the preacher talk about love. "Everett is about the strangest child I've ever seen," Meri replied. "You mean was the strangest child, Luann," Everett's wife corrected. "I mean just exactly what I said. That man has still got a 3-year-old child walking around inside him. Don't know a single man that does it." Read that again. "I mean just exactly what I said. That man has still got a 3-year-old child walking around inside him. Don't know a single man that doesn't." Meri lowered her head so as to get Everett's wife fixed inside the proper lens of her trifocals. "That's the only thing that makes most men worth living with. Fact that they've got a little bit of the little boy inside them. Keep that little boy laughing and you've got a happy man on your hands. That's the only thing that makes most men worth living with. Fact that they've got a little bit of the little boy inside them. Keep that little boy laughing and you've got a happy man on your hands." I like that. Luann took that and told it all over town, and everybody she talked to shook their heads and smiled and said something like, "Yes, sir, that's just like Meri, isn't it? That's one of the finest women God ever set on this earth." Then somebody else would nod like they were thinking it for the very first time and say, "Yes, sir, a real beautiful woman," and no one would dispute it. Of course, they weren't talking about any beauty that you could see. Sometimes somebody would talk about how she'd been a real beauty when she was younger, but it was all hearsay. There was nobody alive anymore who had known Meri as a young girl, except some people as old and dottery as Meri, and they had more sense in their heads than to talk about something that didn't mean 2 shakes to anybody anymore. Whatever it was, that beauty kept people stopping by. Friends of her children and their wives, and sometimes even their children, would stop and say something like, "I was over in the neighborhood and I thought maybe I'd just drop in and say hello." It was all pure silliness, what they said, because Meri didn't live in the neighborhood of anybody except a couple of tobacco farms and the town's dairy. But like most people, they were embarrassed to say what was on their minds or even admit it to themselves. And these visiting women would prop up their children on their laps and hope that the young ones would behave, because for some reason that they couldn't explain, what Meri thought about their children was very important. And Meri would smile a little smile that barely turned up the edges of her mouth, but brought such warmth to her eyes that even the most rambunctious of children would quiet down and smile back. And she would reach out one shaky bent hand and run a finger down the side of the young one's face and then say something like, "I believe there's some homemade butterscotch in that jar in the kitchen by the window. Can you be a big boy and lift off that top real careful?" And the child might not even know what homemade butterscotch tasted like, but there was something about Meri that made them pretty doggone sure that whatever it was good. So they'd make round moon eyes and nod solemnly, and if they were real polite, they might even answer with the best "yes, ma'am." Then Meri would run her finger down their cheek one more time, as though she was trying to draw a little of their beauty and joy out and hold it in her own hand. "Go on then," she'd say, "and when you go back outside, mind you stay off the grape arbor." The mothers would have some question they'd probably thought up on the way out there, like, "I'd just like to have your recipe for homemade peach jam," Or maybe it was, I can't seem to get my lemon chest pies to set up right. Or their husbands would stop by because they thought Meri could use a couple of their extra geraniums. And the wives would just come along for the ride. But sooner or later, the real reason for their visit would come out. Maybe it was a sick child. Maybe a husband couldn't seem to hold down a steady job. Or perhaps it was some real deep marital problems. There was trouble with loved ones and ones that weren't loved at all. With jobs and houses and money and people. There were worries and fears and doubts and terrors that woke them up in the middle of the night, leaving them teary-eyed and heart-sore and sweaty-palmed and shaky. Sooner or later, those problems all came out. And Meri listened. She didn't often say much, and when she did speak, it wasn't for very long. Mostly she just sat and looked at the person there beside her with those expressive eyes of hers, even as they swam behind her trifocals. Meri's eyes held more love than most people ever thought existed on this earth, and when it came time to reach out and comfort those burdened with the world's woes, Meri's eyes filled the room with light. After the words and sometimes the tears had passed, folks tended to sit for a time, sharing in Meri's silence, and when the outside world called them back again to stoves and jobs and restless children, they carried a bit of Meri's stillness along with them. The strange thing was, people rarely talked about sitting there with Meri. To their closest friends, they might say something like, "I stopped by to see Meri today. She gave me her special recipe for German chocolate layer cake," and then smile in an almost embarrassed fashion, as though there was something to be ashamed about in being so touched by something they couldn't put into words. The closest they ever came to explaining it was by describing something external. For example, Everett kept telling his wife, Luann, that he ought to have those 7 Bibles his mother kept stacked by her television rebound. They were so ragged and worn with age and use that they had to be held together with binder twine. "Someday they're going to be all that's left of that woman," Everett would say, and right then and there Luann would make him stop. She just couldn't bear to imagine a world without Meri. One young man was just out of seminary school and real worried about getting sent to a good church. He found himself driving out by Meri's one day, kind of meandering all over the county before deciding what he wanted to do with his afternoon. That evening he told a couple of his buddies it had seemed as if the old needlepoint that hung above the hall door, the one that said, "In everything give thanks," had shone in his eyes the whole time he'd sat in Meri's front parlor. The next day the young man was real embarrassed about what he'd said, even though nobody laughed at him. He promised himself never to talk about stuff like that ever again. He called it conduct unbecoming to a minister. The first Wednesday after the young minister's visit, Everett stopped by Meri's, as usual, to find his elder brother Jonas working out by the woodshed. Jonas was the son who most resembled their father, big and gangly and silent, a real lover of the land. Jonas had stayed there where he had been born, building his own farmhouse down at the base of the hill, tilling his garden on land that his father's father had first cleared and planted, making his living as a joiner and a cabinet maker. Everett stood and watched Jonas for a spell, wondering what brought him up here in the middle of the week. Feeling pretty put out that his Wednesday morning routine was being disturbed, finally he said, "Jonas, what in Sam Hill are you doing?" "Mama wants to make a quilt," Jonas said in his quiet, slow-talking way, not even looking up from his work. He handled the wood planer and hand sander and hammer as if they were all extension of his rough-hewn hands. Everett sucked in the belly that he told everybody had come with his job on account of his brother standing there all sunburned and rock solid. He opened his mouth but closed it again. He didn't know exactly how he could say what was really bothering him. which was that he looked forward all week to having these few moments alone with Meri. He didn't often talk about anything more than what farm prices were doing or some problem he was having in the office. But way down deep inside himself, Everett knew he always walked away from those mornings a better man. Jonas straightened and wiped a sweaty brow and spoke as though he were reading his brother's mind. Mama called down this morning, said she wanted me up just soon as I finished my coffee. Told Jody if I wasn't up here in record time, she was going to cut herself a switch. Everett didn't smile. That old woman's got no more business starting a quilt than I do flying off to the moon. You said it, Jonas agreed and bent back to work. Everett watched him and saw the same solid quality taking shape that marked everything Jonas did. Everett stifled a familiar twinge of jealousy as he stood and watched his brother. Everett was the one who had the big house in the city, the fancy car, the office with the swivel-back leather chair, and the 2 secretaries. His brother worked from dawn to dusk and barely made ends meet. Yet when Jonas turned his hand to something, it was with an artist's skill. For someone who knew how to make it right, as Jonas did, a quilting frame looked like a child's idea of a 4-poster bed without the mattress. The 4 corner posts stuck up in both directions about the same distance so that the quilt could either be turned right side up or upside down or on either end. A quilt required maybe 6 months of handiwork, so it was important for the quilter to reach every little corner in the most comfortable fashion possible. There were solid little wooden blocks with big washers and wing nuts all the way around the sides so that the quilt could be stretched out tight. Then with a quick flip of the wrist be released. Once the cotton batting was laid out and basted into place, the best place to work on the finer stitching was by the biggest window in the house, sitting in the favorite rocker with crowds of memories and good thoughts for company. That was the joy of quilting, watching the little raggedy patches of material be joined into a work of timeless beauty, and knowing that no matter how many hours were put in there today, there were still 100 days left to do. Mama's waiting for you, Jonas finally said. Better go in before she throws the coffee out. I still say she ain't got any business starting a quilt, Everett said, and turned on his heel. He was barely in the door before he said to Meri, You mind telling me what's gotten into you? You know, I believe there's a mockingbird that's decided to nest on my bedroom windowsill, Meri said, not looking up from the well-worn book opened in her lap. Can you imagine anything nicer than a summer filled with mockingbirds greeting the dawn? Everett walked in the kitchen and made as much clatter as he could while pouring a cup of coffee, just to show Meri how indignant he really was. When he came back into the sitting room, he said, Mama, I want to know what you think you're up to here. With a sigh, Meri shut the Bible, careful to lift it from the back with both hands. I thought this one was going to be the one to see me to the grave, but I declare the pages fall out if I look at them hard. You think maybe you could pick me up another Bible? Maybe one of those with big letters would be nice. You're not answering my question, Mama. Put down your coffee cup and come over here and kiss me hello. Not till you answer me. Meri tilted her head upward and focused on her son through the trifocals. In her mildest voice she told him, You're not too old to get a taste of my mind, young man. Everett didn't waste any more time. Anybody who knew Meri knew that her last warning was always given in the quietest manner. After that, it was time to go looking for cover. That's better, Meri said once her cheek had been buzzed. Now sit down over there where I can see you and tell me about the family. Everett sat down with an exaggerated sigh and decided to risk it. Mama, what on earth do you think you're going to do? You can't even... Don't you go telling me what I can and can't do, Meri replied. There has been something bothering me for almost a year now, something I've left undone. Been searching for it for the best part of every night, wondering if maybe the Lord was trying to tell me something. But a quilt, Mama? Everett protested. He gave a swift glance at her hands. The arthritis had turned the fingers sideways so they stuck out from her palm at this weird angle. Everett didn't like to look at Mary's hands. It always gave him this little twist of pain down in his gut. If that's what the Lord wants me to do, son, then that's what I'm going to do. There was a firmness to Mary's voice that brooked no further argument. Now tell me about the family. Everett held his peace in front of Meri, but that evening he really let his wife Luann know what he thought of it all. Can you imagine? Everett pushed his dessert plate back far enough to lean both elbows heavily on the table. The woman can barely read a big letter Bible. She's got to have the television almost in her lap to see it. Fingers all bent over. Shoot, I wonder how she'll even be able to pick up a needle. And she thinks she's going to sew herself another quilt. Luann thought of the 4 quilts Meri had already done for them. The big one for their own bed, and the three with patches of animal-covered fabrics for the children. Meri makes the prettiest quilts I ever saw. Made, honey. Meri made the prettiest quilts. I didn't say anything about that now, did I? Not a peep. Wouldn't trade anything for those pretty ones upstairs. Sell my car before I sold my quilt. Wasn't talking about that for a minute. I just don't want the old lady to get disappointed. Luann knew better than to hit her husband head on with any disagreement when he was in one of his moods. She tell you how the Lord told her to do the quilt? No, she didn't, and I bet you it was because she was afraid I'd show her just how wrong she was to even think it. He picked up the last bit of pie his littlest girl had left on her plate and pushed it in his mouth, then licked his fingers carefully. Luann made just about the best brown sugar pie he'd ever tasted. She even managed to improve on the recipe Meri'd given her. I don't know, honey. Luann stood and started gathering plates. Mary's not the type of lady to say it was a message from the Lord when it wasn't. Mama's the best woman I know, he said to her, retreating back, then added hastily, except for you, honey. But I do declare she's getting on. You know, she reached that point where maybe she's not thinking so clearly anymore. Luann appeared in the kitchen doorway. Don't you let her hear you say that. What, you think you're married to a crazy man? Everett asked, rolling his eyes. Being an intelligent woman who loved her husband very much, Luann hid her smile in the kitchen and held her tongue. You know what I love the most about Meri, Luann told Jody, Jonas's wife, the next morning. She's always so involved. That just about says it all, Jody agreed. She's just about the most involved woman I've ever met. But Luann wasn't finished. You don't ever get the feeling that she's just sitting there on the sidelines watching you go through whatever it is that's ailing you. Meri's right in there with you. When I talk to her, sometimes it's like I'm talking right to her heart. Like there's not a thing between me and all that love. Just scoop out all you need and carry it away, Jody added. If I was sick, I'd rather go talk with Meri for 5 minutes than have 15 doctors work on me all day, Luann's next-door neighbor and best friend Lynn Forrest told them. Luann and Meri were the only persons in the whole wide world who still called her Lynn. When her husband Tommy had started courting her, he had renamed her Rooster on account of her red hair, her jerky way of moving, and the fact that her maiden name had been Roasters. Lynn said knowing that she was going to have to hear that for the rest of her life, had just about done the marriage in before it had started. There were 5 of them gathered in Jody's kitchen that morning. Amy Harris was a friend from down the road, a heavy-set woman with the biggest laugh anybody had ever heard. Her laugh wasn't loud, it was just plain big. When Amy laughed, there was just too much happiness and humor there for anybody within hearing range not to smile. Her friends had the habit of looking over at one another when they heard that big bell-shaped laugh ring out. It gave them something to grin about without being so self-conscious. They would look at one another and chuckle like, "There she goes again. Amy's laughing." Can you believe it? Amy didn't mind their laughing at her. It was enough just to have them laugh. The other woman was a tiny wisp of a lady Lynn's husband Tommy had renamed Tidbit. Her real name was Nancy Starling, and she made up for her lack of size with an energy that was just plain awesome. She had stood a full 4 feet 10 inches tall in her lace-up shoes and weighed about as much as a wet breeze. She was a nurse at the hospital where Lynn worked as a physical therapist, and had the tendency to make her patients want to stand at attention in bed when she walked into the room. Nancy needed to stand on her tiptoes to take their temperature when the beds were cranked upright, but even the doctors had long since learned not to cross Nurse Tidbit, as everyone called her behind her back. Tommy's names had a habit of sticking like burrs in a horse's mane. "That woman is a saint," Nancy said, quietly washing blackberries with a speed that made her hands blur. "Every time I see her, I tell myself, I wish there was something more I could do for her." They had been out picking blackberries and were getting ready to make cobbler. They were all itching from red bug bites and stained from forehead to knees with blackberry juice, and all were having an enormously good time. Jody was known for making the best blackberry cobbler in 3 counties, but the pies were really just an excuse for 5 good friends to get together and ramble through the woods and laugh and spend a morning catching up on one another's lives. "It's hard to do anything for Meri," Jody agreed, pressing out a dozen mounds of pie crust batter with her rolling pins. One of the secrets of her cobbler was that the crust was made with butter cookie dough. "She makes me feel like a little girl playing with her mother's things whenever I say I'd like to help her with something." "Maybe so," Luann said, "but just the same, I'm worried about her this time. She's too old to be taking on a quilt by herself." "Maybe if we all went together she'd listen to us," Nancy said doubtfully. "We'll take up one of the cobblers and talk to her," Jody decided for all of them. But it sure as goodness wasn't all easy street, taking a fresh baked pie or cake into Mary's house. She was the legendary baker to 3 generations. The highest accolade a cake or pie could receive was, "You've been taking lessons up at Mary's, haven't you?" Meri rarely said anything when somebody brought baked goods by. She'd just sit and smile her heartfelt smile, take a little silver pie fork and taste the first tiny sliver. The guests would slide up close to the edge of her chair and hold their breath. Meri would take this teensy bite, close her eyes a minute, open them, and smile again. That gave the guests signal to smile back, which was pretty hard with that their heart in their throat and their palms slick. Then came the verdict. If Meri put the cake down, it was back to the kitchen, girl, and try again. But if she took another bite, well, rest assured there was a winner here. So Jody was understandably worried when she walked up the long hill drive from her home to Mary's. Unconsciously, the others all kind of pulled in behind her, but their worries were forgotten when they walked into Mary's living room and found her sorting through a pile of beautiful old clothes. "Been up since dawn washing all these old things," Meri said in greeting. "That after spending half the night trying to remember where I stored them." In Mary's typical neat fashion, the quilt frame was set up against the far wall, as much out of the way as a 7x7 wood frame with 3-foot corner posts could be in a formal setting parlor, especially a frame which was fitted with the stretch of the prettiest pastel blue cotton backing any of the ladies had ever seen. "I brought you a homemade blackberry cobbler," Jody said, her eyes caught by the frame and the backing. "Mama, Where on earth did you get that beautiful cloth? Bless your heart, child, just put it on the kitchen cabinet and we'll have it in a bit. Meri straightened from the pile with a grimace and a hand pressing hard on her back. Been bent over for too long, I reckon. You ought to sit down for a while, Jody said, handing the pie to Nancy and hurrying over. To their surprise, Meri did not object. She let herself be led over and seated by the window. All she said was, "Got an awful lot of work ahead of me." Jody knelt beside the chair. "Mama, you just have to let us help you with this." "Isn't that pretty cloth?" Meri said in reply, looking over at the quilt frame. "It came to me last night. I found that, it must be 5 years ago if it's a day. You remember old Miss Lane used to run that fabric shop downtown?" "Course I do, Mama, but it was more than 5 years. Miss Lane passed away. My goodness, it must have been 10 or 11 years now." "Whenever it was just before she closed that pretty shop of hers. She came by for coffee one day and gave me that fabric you see over there. Said she had been saving it for someone special." Amy walked over to the quilt frame, ran her hand down the cloth, and exclaimed, "Will you just come over here and feel this? That's the softest cotton I've ever seen." "Feels like velvet," Nancy agreed. "What is it, Miss Meri? Some mixture with silk thread?" "I'm sure I don't know. All I remember is what Miss Lane said to me. The first time she felt it, she knew it'd make somebody a very special quilt. Mrs. Lane planned to use it herself, but what with one thing and another, she never got around to it. Meri was quiet for a very long time. It just came to me. Wasn't more than a week after she gave me this material that we laid Mrs. Lane in her grave. She was a fine woman," Jody said, a small smile of remembrance playing on her face. "She used to teach my Sunday school. Her boys used to help us out around the place," Meri said. "Big, fine boys, both of them." "I didn't know she had any children, Miss Meri," Luann said. "That was back before your time, honey. Didn't either of them come back from the war." "This sure is nice fabric," Nancy said. "I can't seem to stop touching it." "No, just exactly what you mean," Meri said. "Been walking around it and looking at it and playing with it ever since I got up." Rooster was on her knees by the pile of brightly colored clothing. She lifted up one dress made of printed fabric with a high hand-knit collar and ruffled sleeves. It was a long dress, so long that when Rooster stood and held it to her body, the hem almost touched the ground. The print was a simple one of tiny red roses. So many, a dozen would barely cover the space of a child's palm, and even tinier pink hearts. It was the kind of print dress that was once sold in every general store in every small town in America, and today wasn't found outside of old-time movies and the antics of people who didn't ever like to throw things away. And it was beautiful. Rooster did a little swirl around, letting the full skirt billow out around her ankles. "Miss Meri, this is just adorable." "Thank you, child," Meri replied, a small smile of memories playing on her lips. "I don't remember ever seeing this before." Jody walked over and lifted the hem. The skirt was richly flounced and trimmed with the same hand-crocheted lace at the sleeves and neckline. "How old is this?" "Older than any of you, I can tell you that for sure," Meri replied. "I was married in that dress." Jody let the hem drop. "And you're going to cut it up for a quilt?" "I most certainly am. Can't imagine what on earth I was doing holding on to that old thing for so long. Wasn't even sure I still had it. Found it down on the bottom of my hope chest. It was still wrapped in the same old paper I put it in. My goodness, it must be 60 years old. Smelled of camphor and mothballs. So bad I had to wash it 6 times. It's a wonder the thing's still in one piece." "But Mama," Jody searched for words, "this dress is priceless." It's in such good condition, Rooster said, lifting so as to inspect the dress more closely. I can't believe it's so old. Meri laughed a short sound which showed her age. I bought that dress at Jones's General Store. Back then, folks came from all over the county to shop there. I can still remember crocheting the lace late at night, praying all the while I would make that man a good wife. Luann reached into the pile and came up with a beautiful blue satin dress. The body looked made for a large doll, but the skirt hung down a good 4 feet. Miss Meri, what on earth is this? What I spent all last night looking for, Meri replied. That was the first nightie Jody's husband ever wore. The ladies had a good laugh over that. Meri went on. I learned this tradition from my own mama, God rest her soul. That's the way we used to dress up our children for their first look at the world. There's 6 of them here, Luann said, sorting through the pile. That's right, honey. I had 6 children. Only 2 of them lived past their first year. I didn't know that, Mama, Jody said. Times changed, child. Back then, there were lots of sicknesses just waiting to snatch the little ones away. All we had was a traveling country doctor and our prayers to see us through. Meri spent a long moment staring down at a beautiful pink gown and said quietly, sometimes it just wasn't enough. But you can't go cutting these up to make a quilt, Mama. Oh, can't I? Meri grasped the sides of her chair and pushed herself erect. You just hand me those scissors over there on the ledge and watch what I can't do. With a swiftness based on long experience, Jody saw she had taken the wrong tack. She moved to Meri's side and tried again. Mama, you've just got to let us help you with this. Meri let herself be seated again. I've been thinking about that too, she admitted. All the while I was rummaging around upstairs and seeing just how tired this old body could get, I've been wondering how on earth I was going to get this quilt finished. We'd love to help you, Luann exclaimed. Sure to goodness would, Miss Meri, Nancy agreed. That's all well and good, Meri said, and I'd be grateful. There's no question about that, but you're all going to have to promise me one thing before you even think about picking up a needle. Anything, Jody said for them all. She looked at the wizened old lady sitting crouched over to one side in the big horsehair settee, saw the hands twisted up sideways with arthritis, and felt down in her heart the lady's incredible burden of years. A lump gathered so big in her throat that she thought for a moment she was going to have to go get a drink of water. This is something the Lord's called me to do, Meri said in that quiet way of hers. I can't explain it to you, but I know just as sure as I know my own name that this is something He wants done. And if I do it for Him, it's got to be the very best quilt I've ever made. Not a stitch out of place, not a piece of material laid wrong. We understand, Luann said, caught up in the seriousness of the moment. There's something else. It came to me this morning as I was putting these things in the wash. For every stitch that goes into this quilt, I want you to say a prayer. And it can't be just any prayer. It has to be a prayer of thanksgiving. A moment of silence greeted her words. Finally, Jody said, with eyes warning her friends, Why, that sounds just fine, Mama. Far too little thanksgiving these days, Meri said, more to herself than to others. With everything the Lord gives us, all we can think of is what we don't have, like a bunch of spoiled children. We'd be happy to do that for you, Miss Meri, Luann said, her eyes mirroring the blankness of Jody's. Not for me, child, not for me, for our Lord. This is His quilt. I'm stopping from now. We'll continue on another time. We're on page 47.